descriptions of real-life violence that some viewers may find distressing. In every murder, there are clues. Vital evidence that points to who the killer is and how they killed.
It wasn't a normal crime scene.
Forensics were crucial.
Every contact leaves a trace.
It's down to detectives, crime scene investigators, and forensic experts to piece those clues together.
It's like trying to do a jigsaw when you haven't got the picture on the box.
Using cutting-edge techniques and the power of science.
His jeans had the profile of the crime scene on them. I know that he had knelt down on the soil.
To convict the killers.
We've got to find him and catch him.
He's probably the most dangerous person I've prosecuted.
And bring justice to the victims.
She's never, ever coming home.
She'll never be forgotten, ever.
In this episode, a street gang on the rampage in the heart of the capital.
This is a central London location. It was very unusual to have such violent attacks in such a public place.
Extreme violence that was part of a disturbing trend sweeping the country.
We were aware of this spate of what was called happy slapping going on.
Made me think of Clockwork Orange because it was all this sort of gleeful hate. Let's have fun, let's go out and have fun and hurt people. It was really horrible and frightening.
A senseless attack that would take the life of a terrorist bomb survivor.
This is an amazing man who's done so much for so many people. He already nearly lost his life once, and now this time it's actually happened.
This is Forensics, Catching the Killer. On the night of Friday, the 30th of April 1999, a nail bomb was detonated in the busy Admiral Duncan pub in the heart of Soho, London. 3 people lost their lives in the blast that night and 79 were injured. One of them was barman David Morley.
Everybody knew who David was. You know, you couldn't not walk through Soho and people not know who this character was, what he did, where he worked. He'd just walk into a room and have this air about him that was just so bright and shiny and like just a great person. With the bombing, I mean, no one would have thought that it would have been his pub. But I mean, even on that day, he got up and helped everybody. That was, it doesn't matter that he'd been, hit and, loads of nails were in him. He actually just got up and helped everybody else that needed the help. Everybody was very shocked, obviously, scared. Yeah, I mean, then the seeds of doubt start coming in, don't they? Am I going to be safe to go and walk the streets? Am I going to be able to do that? I mean, you would think that then it would maybe scare him, but he wouldn't allow that to happen. And he was very, very adamant about that. I'm not going to let this get me down. I'm not going to let this stop me from being able to walk through the streets, the town that I love, the city that I love so very much. And he used to love walking around the South Bank. It was so pretty. It was his place.
Nearly 5 years later, though, David was to be the victim of another headline-grabbing attack.
First time I came down here would have been on the Saturday evening. It was an October evening, obviously it was dark and cold. The scene looks very different then as to how it looks today.
Detective Chief Inspector Nick Scola had been called to London's South Bank after a number of violent assaults had left several victims seriously injured. The Riverside Walk is one of central London's most popular areas, drawing in tourists to its attractions such as the London Eye, while its galleries and theatres are at the heart of the city's cultural scene.
Despite the fact it was relatively quiet at the time of the attack, 3 o'clock in the morning, this is a central London location. It was very unusual to have such violent attacks in such a public place. Tourists would walk up and down here, people would work in the area. It was a very vibrant, thriving area, and in my experience, almost unheard of for this level of violence to be inflicted on someone. No apparent reason. The information I got when I was first told was quite sketchy, because it's very early into the investigation. No one really knew what had happened. They knew there'd been a number of attacks around the South Bank area. Wasn't yet sure whether they were connected or not.
Among those attacked that night was 37-year-old bar manager David and his friend Alistair Whiteside.
This is where the attack would have taken place. There were hoardings there where this complex was being built, and just this side of the hoardings, 2 benches. David and Alistair were sitting on those benches, minding their own business when the group came along and attacked them. They carried out the attack there on the benches, then carried on down the embankment under the bridge, where they carried out attacks number 3 and 4.
There were concerns it was a homophobic attack, precisely because of what was known about David and his background and how well known he was within the community. On the wider issues, the other feedback I was getting from the other attacks, that the victims weren't gay. So it was a difficult decision. However, being uncertain, I thought it best at that stage to declare it as a homophobic attack. It certainly helps the investigation. It makes the community more likely to come forward and give information. Another aspect of declaring it as homophobic is it definitely increases the media attention. There's no bad publicity. The more the story is out in the media, the more likely you are for people to want to help you, to want to become involved, to be part of it, and to give information. They've got less excuse to hold that information back.
Mark Healy knew David from the Admiral Duncan pub and is an anti-hate crime specialist.
When I found out about the attack, I was told that it was David who was involved, and he'd been quite severely attacked and was in hospital. News spread pretty fast afterwards. I think it had a devastating impact on the LGBT community. It was a horrific attack. It was somebody that was well known within the community. Especially with David being a barman, who was a popular barman. He would have served, during the course of his lifetime, thousands and thousands of people. So he was known by thousands of people.
Despite emergency surgery, the injuries David sustained were so severe that he died that evening. The investigation into a spate of serious assaults had now become a murder inquiry. In 2004, 37-year-old David Morley was punched and kicked to death following a night out in central London. David was one of 8 people attacked by a gang of assailants in a brutal 50-minute violent rampage. Metropolitan Police Detective Nick Scola was now on the hunt for David's killers.
When you first turn up as a senior investigating officer for an incident like this, essentially all your thoughts are around how am I going to solve it. I looked at the area where the attack took place to establish if there had been any CCTV opportunities or any places where witnesses may have been overlooking and may have eyewitnesses to the attack. And then just got a feel for the wider area, because reports have been coming in about other attacks.
The speed and volume of the assaults made for a challenging start to the investigation.
Because we had 3 attacks in this area in quite quick succession, there was some confusion in the way they were reported. Some people phoned 999 immediately on their phones. Others approached the security staff at the London Eye and reported there, and they phoned 999. So bringing a delay into the calls. So when you look at the timings the following day that we received all the emergency calls, it was very unclear the order in which the attacks took place.
As Nick and his team began their inquiries, the post-mortem examination by the forensic pathologist revealed vital clues as to how David had died.
The findings were quite stark, really. The pathologist described the injuries that David had as being similar to a fall from height or being hit by a moving car, and that it just illustrated the ferocity of the attack. Bearing in mind, no weapons were used, they were just punches and kicks that had led to those kinds of injuries.
The post-mortem examination would reveal that David suffered 44 separate injuries, including 5 broken ribs. The cause of his death was due to hemorrhaging from the broken ribs and a ruptured spleen. The method of the gang's vicious attack on David would help give investigators a link to the other victims.
David's friend Alistair, he was also attacked, and he could give a description of the attacks, although he couldn't really see much of what's happening to David because he was covering up himself. He wasn't attacked with a weapon either, and we were getting more confident the same group had carried out all the attacks.
Following the assault on David and Alistair, the gang would move on to nearby Jubilee Gardens, where the violence continued.
Jubilee Gardens is a small area, and for 2 attacks to take place within that small area, I think the reason being they were just looking for targets of opportunity. So as they went through Jubilee Gardens, they stumbled across one group, were able to attack them, and then leaving, they just found another victim and couldn't help themselves.
In Jubilee Gardens, the first group to be targeted were 3 students.
We've got the grassed area and the trees. They were sitting there just minding their own business, drinking beer, when the group of attackers came up to them and just began to assault them with no preamble at all, just began kicking and punching them.
They would also steal a mobile phone and beer from the group as they moved on to their next victim.
They fled down towards the London Eye, and the group then moved further into the gardens, where they carried out another attack on Nigel Elliott.
The gang would hit him with the beer bottle and repeatedly kicked him. Finally, they attacked a sleeping homeless man close to Waterloo Station.
That's the final attack in Leek Street. He's asleep, he doesn't even know it's coming, he's still laying down. They suddenly start jumping up and down on him, stamping him. They didn't need to punch him, he stayed on the ground throughout the whole incident, and they just stamped and stamped on him. There's no planning involved. They were walking around looking for people, perhaps homeless, perhaps vulnerable, out at 3 o'clock in the morning. Some of them were on their own. The targets were just too much for them. They couldn't resist the urge to attack them.
But who were the gang, and what was their motivation for the attacks? Detectives turned to the capital's extensive network of CCTV cameras in a bid to identify them.
We were fortunate enough to capture CCTV from several good locations, and that in itself helps us link the group to other CCTV images so we can track their movements around the crime scene. We got footage of the first attack in Lower Marsh Street, which is about 50 minutes before the final attack in Leek Street. The final bit of CCTV we find of the group on the night of the attacks is in League Street. It runs underneath Waterloo Station and had probably the best CCTV of the evening. It's interesting because he's on CCTV, you can see the behaviour of the group. They see him there, they stop, they discuss what they're going to do. Then one of the members of the group, the female, she gets a phone out and starts to record. And then you see the other members of the group, or three of the male members of the group, go up the stairs into the elevated area above the pavement where the man's sleeping, and just begin the most brutal attack on him.
The South Bank attacks were the latest in a disturbing trend of incidents sweeping the capital. Liz Wickham was a TV news reporter in London at the time.
I was medical correspondent most of the time, although I did straight news stories as well. And we were aware of this spate of what was called happy slapping going on. This was something really quite strange. It was groups of young teenage people, disaffected, angry, apparently desperate to find people who they could look down upon, or they thought they could look down upon. So they would choose groups in society, gay groups, disabled groups, homeless groups, that they could victimise and, I don't know, walk away feeling better about themselves in some way. It made me think of Clockwork Orange because it was all this sort of gleeful hate. You know, let's have fun, let's go out and have fun and hurt people. It was really horrible and frightening and meaningless.
And it now appeared the so-called happy slapping did have darker undertones.
We obviously knew then that this was a homophobic attack because it involved David. And of course, the terrible thing for me was that David had been on TV a lot, or quite a lot, as a gay man who'd been attacked. And I hate the thought that somehow he was identified as a potential victim.
On the South Bank, while Senior Investigating Officer Nick Scola appealed for more witnesses, forensic officers had the difficult task of securing potential evidence across multiple locations. Callum Sutherland, also known as Cass by his colleagues, was the crime scene manager on the case.
My main objective was, well, where this has happened, samples of any blood, cigarette ends, bottles, anything that might help me to find out who has done this, and to be able to put them at that scene.
But with 5 separate crime scenes spread across nearly half a mile and open to the weather, retrieving forensic evidence would be extremely difficult for Callum and his CSI team.
With an outside scene, it's very different because you've got the elements to worry about. Rain getting on bottles, DNA on cigarette ends could be affected by the rain and other things. And of course you've got the public and keeping them away from the areas as well. So that takes up quite a lot of officers to man all those scenes to keep people away. The number of tourists that go up and down there is unbelievable.
Despite the numerous locations, Sutherland's team got a result. Forensic exhibits collected from one of them would help corroborate CCTV evidence that the same gang carried out the attacks.
In the attack after Morley's, there was 2 people who were drinking bottles of Stella. They were attacked, but their beer was taken from them. As the suspects then went across the green, they threw or hit a guy who was walking across there with a bottle. It was reasonable to assume, because of the DNA on that bottle being from the people who had been attacked after Morley. The fact that it was on that grass version, the gentleman had been attacked with that bottle, that it was the same group, and the course of events was they took the bottle from him. That links those two together, because that bottle couldn't have got from A to B without it being in the hands of one of the suspects.
We got the news from the forensics those two sites were definitely linked. It was very reassuring to know your suspicions were correct, and you knew evidentially, and when we took the case to court, it would be much stronger evidence to say that those sites were definitely linked, and the same attackers had been involved in both attacks.
Sadly, no forensic evidence to help identify who carried out the attack came from the recovered bottle. While police attempted to identify who had killed David, his friends were struggling to come to terms with his death.
It was crazy, actually. I was just numb, but obviously my head was buzzing with, why, who, how could they do this to him? Why do this to him? This is an amazing man who's done so much for so many people. He already nearly lost his life once, and now this time it's actually happened.
There's that feeling in the sense of like when someone's been through something as horrific as he went through, on how nasty it is that he would then go through such an awful event again afterwards, and that it would end up taking his life.
Why would you want to take somebody away that was such an amazing guy and everybody loved? I couldn't get it in my head, and everybody was asking the same question.
TV news reporter Liz Wickham, who had met David following the Admiral Duncan bombing, was equally as shocked to learn of his death.
It affected me profoundly that I knew David, and that my involvement with him had started with horror but had gradually become more optimistic. The fact that was suddenly cut away, and he was cut away and murdered. I mean, how many people get attacked by two entirely disaffected groups, two different disaffected groups, and falls victim to both, survives one only to be killed by the other one? The odds are incredible, and it was so sad and so wrong, and for me it was most peculiar. I've never experienced anything like that before, and I sincerely hope never to again.
Less than a week after the attack, more than 1,000 people turned out to remember David at a candlelit vigil in Soho.
The streets, the people that turned out, and we did the walk up to Soho, the church, and we had the gay chorus choir turn up, and it was amazing that so many people loved him and came out to celebrate his life, basically, because that's what it was all about.
As David's friends celebrated his life, DCI Nick Scola and his team were uncovering more clues to help discover those responsible for the popular barman's death. CCTV footage of the gang's last attack could now hold the key to forensically identifying them.
What they didn't realise, of course, was that attack was on CCTV, and as an investigation tool, it was of great value. We could see exactly what they were doing, but most importantly, we could see where they were bracing their hands whilst the attack was being carried out. And the crime scene manager, Kaz Sutherland, he was very interested in that, and he was very confident that he would get finger marks off that door. I wasn't so sure. I said, Kaz, you sure they could be wearing gloves? It's dirty down there. He was very confident. He said he had the equipment that he was going to try out to see what he could achieve.
Autumn 2004, and police in London are hunting a gang responsible for the death of barman David Morley. David was one of 8 people badly beaten up in a so-called happy slapping rampage. While the other victims survived, David had succumbed to his injuries in hospital. days after David's death, the gang remained unidentified and at large. The forensic team's focus now was on retrieving vital evidence from the final crime scene.
Finding that CCTV was a big breakthrough, because you could clearly see in it that as they assaulted him, they were leaning against these great big metal doors, which were the fire escape for when the Euro Star train was at Waterloo. So that for us was, we thought, well, that's where we've got a good chance of getting fingerprints here, and there's a good chance that these kids who are doing things like that may well have a criminal record. The problem was how best were we going to get fingerprints off this, because this door, it was like a really heavy metal, but because of what the door was made of, and the kind of like had golf ball shapes on it, so which made it more difficult because you haven't got a nice flat surface for a fingerprint to come on. So then we tried different fingerprint powders, didn't work. We tried different light sourcing with a light source expert. It didn't work. So we kind of put our heads together. So, well, what do you think what can we do?
Sutherland's next option was to hope that the contact with the doors had left another unique trace of the attackers at the scene.
Well, the only thing we can do is swab in the areas for their DNA. But of course, you could see in the CCTV roughly where they touched it, but looking at something on a screen and then in real life to get the height comparison of exactly where it is a little bit more difficult.
With tried and tested scenes of crime techniques failing to provide fingerprint or DNA samples, ideally the doors would have been removed and transported to a laboratory for more specialist testing.
I mean, the doors must have weighed tons. We couldn't remove them to take them to the lab to put them in what's called a superglue chamber. Where you touch something, and I think the sweat from your finger leaves a mark on something, but the superglue will kind of like bind to it, and it creates a sort of white fingerprint, and it brings up stuff that the human eye cannot see at all. And it will, once it's brought it up, it will stay there for a long time. You might get something partial, but then you can use other chemicals to colour it and enhance that fingerprint, or light sourcing again that will bring it out.
As the doors' size and weight meant they couldn't go to the lab, Callum had to bring the lab to the doors.
We decided to call out a guy from the lab who is a fingerprint specialist in different chemicals and different things to try to get fingerprints. And he said, well, what we could do is maybe build a superglue chamber. To my knowledge, this was the first time this had ever been done in an outside scene. Sat down and sort of worked out how this was going to happen. And basically what we did was get a frame and then thick black plastic sheeting, attached that well above where we could see that the height of their hands had got, sellotaped it down with really strong tape. Fans were put in to heat the glue up, and then we thought, well, we'll leave it for, I think it was a day or two, and just see what happens, because that's the best chance we've got.
Health and safety concerns meant that the street had to be sealed off for a total of 48 hours. Only then would Callum discover if the ambitious experiment had worked.
And lo and behold, we got sets of fingerprints in the areas where you could see the people who'd been giving this gentleman a beating. We found fingerprints.
2 different finger mark samples were analysed and compared with a national database. And soon, detectives had names. David Blenman, a 16-year-old, and another teenager, Darren Case. Both were known to police for petty crime. With 2 possible members of the gang identified, detectives would turn to a new, emerging discipline within forensics to find another. Angus Marshall is an expert in the field of digital forensics.
back then we were really at the start of digital forensic processing of mobile phones. It was quite a new discipline. Up till then, the main interest had been in computers and hard drives, the large storage devices that they had. But around 2003, with the switching on of the 3G network, phones started to develop a lot more capabilities. The problem for most police forces was that they had two different units dealing with digital evidence. One of them was the computer unit, the other one was the telecoms unit, and the telecoms unit's main interest was call data. So when dealing with mobile phones, they could extract call histories, contacts lists, and text messages from phones, and that was about it.
Despite the limitations, this call data would help Nick Scola's investigation into the attacks.
During the attack on David and Alistair's phone was taken. The phone wasn't discarded or thrown in the river as I feared might have happened when I first came to the scene. They took it and they used it. And of course, in that era, lock screens were quite unusual, so it was very easy to take a stolen phone and use it.
Alistair's wasn't the only phone stolen that night. One of the members of the gang had used another victim's phone to make a call to his girlfriend.
The network had a record of that call being made, and that information would also been stored in that handset as well. So anyone looking at the call records or looking at the call logs on the phone would see in there that there was an unusual number, one that it didn't normally have contact with, appeared in those records. In this particular instance, that then opened up a new line of inquiry. Why had that handset been contacting the girlfriend?
The phone was vital in giving us an idea of the people the attackers knew, who they contacted, the frequency of that contact, in the hope it would lead us back to the person using the phone by identifying who his friends were.
The man making a call to his girlfriend on a stolen mobile phone was Rhys Sargent, a 20-year-old from the Kennington area of the city. This wasn't the only information provided by the mobile phone.
The other interesting aspect was not so much digital evidence as a digital device, and it was the SIM from Alistair Whiteside's phone. It was found in an unusual location. It was found away from the phone as well. The fact that Alistair Whiteside's SIM was found near the attackers' homes was highly unusual. There was no reason for Alistair Whiteside to have been in that location. There was certainly no reason for him to have taken the SIM out of his phone in that location or to have changed the SIM there. So it allowed police to start asking the question, why was that SIM in that location? What had caused that SIM to be moved to that location? And then who had moved it and deposited it there?
"5 days after David had been killed, and armed with CCTV, fingerprints and information from the stolen phone, Nick Scola's team began to round up the main suspects.
We started to make arrests and do the questioning of the people we believed were involved, and that eventually took us to all 6 suspects.
Police now moved to arrest 20-year-old Sargent, 17-year-old Case, and 16-year-old Blenman. Perhaps most shocking of all was the arrest of Chelsea O'Mahony, who was 14 years old.
I was surprised to find out that these were very young people, teenagers. There were no reasons to be attacking particular people. It's just hate. It's just anger and hate that's kind of directionless, I suppose. It was horrifying. I mean, I had a daughter of my own, a teenage daughter of my own, and it's so far from what you could ever imagine happening. And you just wonder, how did she grow up? What was life like for her? Why did she hate everybody so much? I was very torn, as a mother of a teenage daughter. I was really torn. I was angry, but I think I was more upset. You just desperately want to talk to someone like that. You want to sit them down and say, What did you think you were doing? You didn't know this man. You might have liked him.
While Chelsea provided little comment on her role on the night of David Morley's death, evidence recovered from her home provided police with more clues to the gang's motivation.
We're hoping to find other evidence relating to the murder, in particular the clothing we knew she was wearing because of the CCTV, both to help us and to prove it was her on the CCTV, and maybe then do forensic tests on it to see if any forensic evidence comes back on that clothing. As part of that search, we recovered her diary, and that was interesting because it detailed previous incidents that were very similar to the incidents of the night of David's death.
Could the teenager's diary help detectives prove the gang were behind the attack that led to David Morley's death? London, 2004, and a total of 6 teenagers are now in custody following a spate of so-called happy slapping attacks that left one man dead. Barman David Morley, a survivor of a homophobic terror attack 5 years earlier, was one of 8 people assaulted by the gang. Kicked and beaten so badly, he died in hospital from his injuries. A search of one of the suspects' homes, 14-year-old Chelsea O'Mahony, suggested that the attack on London's South Bank wasn't a one-off.
2 weekends before in October, she described going out, she called them all-nighters, where her and others, and she named some of the others in her diary, would go out and attack vulnerable people, homeless men, in the early hours of the morning. She quite excitedly detailed these accounts. So it was an interesting document. It showed a little insight into Chelsea's mind. And it was just hard to believe that this had become their Saturday night entertainment. This group, as Sunday decided, they would all meet up after midnight, go roaming the streets of Kennington, looking for vulnerable, homeless, single people who they could intimidate and attack simply for their own pleasure. And whilst doing so, they would, on occasions, film those attacks.
We know that she was using an NEC mobile phone, and 2 handsets in particular had been commissioned by the 3 network around that time. Both of them had video capability. They were really designed for making video calls, but they were also capable of storing up to about 100 photographs or 100 short video clips of about 12 seconds each. So it's possible that she was taking video clips of the attack in progress. Potentially, she could even have made a video call to someone to show them what was going on. But without access to the call records, it's just really not possible to say. I would think it's more likely that video recording was being used.
And Chelsea was also the one who we know filmed attacks, because you can clearly see her in the final attack in the underpass of the man sleeping in the doorway. Whilst 3 of the group are carrying the attack out, you can see Chelsea in various locations around the attack, with her phone held in front of her. And it was the very early days for camera phones, but she was undoubtedly filming the attack. Sadly, whatever phones we recovered following the arrests, we never were able to get that phone to use as evidence, because it may have revealed details of the other attacks on the night as well.
9 days after the rampage of violence beside the River Thames, Nick Scola and his team had enough evidence to charge the 6 teenagers.
So with our forensic evidence, fingerprints, we had 2 of the group we knew were at the scene, and we had contact between the group using the phones. We had the CCTV, and we recovered clothing matching the blurred images. I was satisfied that we'd got the right people.
Almost a year since the attacks that left David dead, those accused of his murder would stand trial at the Old Bailey. The trial would last 6 weeks.
The eventual verdict after a long trial was that 2 of the group were acquitted and 4 of the group were found guilty of manslaughter, not murder. And so the jury felt, looking at the attacks and hearing the evidence, that the attackers didn't intend to cause really serious harm. They just intended to cause some harm, and thereby, well, and for that reason, found them guilty of manslaughter. I'm certain their age would have a lot to do with it.
Sargent, Case and Blenman all received 12-year sentences. O'Mahony, 15 at the time of the trial, received 8 years. David's killing wasn't prosecuted as a hate crime. Crucial to the success of the prosecution was CCTV evidence coupled with the innovative method of putting 2 members of the gang at the scene with their fingerprints.
The fingerprints, vital. The suspects couldn't argue with those fingerprints. They weren't subjective. Without forensics, it was highly unlikely this case would have been solved. There's no doubt about that.
For me, it was of great satisfaction that we'd got that. But I think what was better about it was that it was teamwork. It was actually discussing it with a light source expert, discussing it with a senior crime officer, discussing it with the fingerprint, chemical forensic expert on different ways of retrieving fingerprints. At the start was something that we felt quite down about, because no matter what we tried, we weren't getting any lifts off the test door. And then it was like, well, why don't we try it, sort of thing, all right. And it worked. It was good.
The verdicts brought some closure for David's friends, but for them, it still felt like a hollow victory.
I miss him an awful lot, yeah. I don't think there's a day goes by where I don't think about him. And I know my other friends that are, that knew him were, the same. He had so many wonderful friends in his life, and they still all love him just as much as I do. What's worth thinking about is the man that I loved and my best friend, and what he did for everybody else. That's what's worth thinking about. It takes a lot of energy to hate people, and hate is not something that David had in him. So you have to block that and just think about the guy. Just think about the man that you loved. And that's what I do think about David,